Welcome to the Grizzly Beat, a podcast of Grizzly Times and Louisa Wilcox, where we interview scientific experts, managers, Native Americans, writers, and others to share their knowledge, perspectives, and experience. This comes at a time of enormous interest in the grizzly bear's future as the government proposes to remove federal protections, and citizens are asking important questions. We hope the information shared here will help listeners shape their own answers. This is Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times, and I'm delighted to be talking today with an old friend and colleague, Dr. Barrie Gilbert. Barrie is a grizzly bear expert and retired professor of animal behavior at Utah State University. And Barrie has studied grizzly bears from Yellowstone to Alaska for 40 years, and he's also studied how they're being managed by the government. Barrie, maybe you could start by sharing how you got interested in grizzly bears and how your career with bears got started.
Yeah, sure. I worked in Yellowstone on a project as a postdoc on antelope behavior there, the pronghorn, I should say. And, of course, that was right in the post-dump Craighead era, and the biologists that I got to know Glenn Cole and the people in the biologist's office were all talking about grizzly bears, and I got an interest. And when I came back to Utah State, I proposed a study to the park, and they funded one student to look at the response of grizzly bears to people on trails. They were concerned about the increased visitation, especially backcountry use, and particularly horse packs and things like that that are going deep into areas where grizzly bears hadn't been exposed to people that much. So I started a study, and unfortunately on the Upper Gallatin, I walked into a bear and sent me to hospital and further study of grizzly bears. But after that, we went to Yosemite and studied black bears. I kept an eye, though, on grizzly management in Yellowstone because I was nearby and I was visiting it. And then I got a chance to go back to grizzly bears in Alaska. Katmai National Park had increased visitation, and they wanted somebody with behavioral experience to see what bears and people were doing on Brooks River. There were increasing numbers of fishermen, and photography was getting big there. So I had a chance to get in right in the middle of 30 or 40 bears and 600 or 700 people, all within about a kilometer. So I really, that gave me a perspective on how bears and people can get along. It got rid of the idea that every grizzly bear is something chomping through the woods that'll see you and then kill you shortly thereafter. I knew there was a possibility that we could get along with bears a lot better, especially the mountain bears. And the mountain bears are more food stressed. I think everybody would agree with that. And they tend to not be as tolerant of people. Maybe it's surprise, but I think after the closure of the dumps and the some 220 to 250 grizzlies that were shot over 3 years by the shot or moved or otherwise disposed of by the rangers in the park when they come into campgrounds after the dumps were closed, I am a great believer that bears carry that experience away from them, being shot at. I'm sure some were wounded and went away. I think the grizzly bears in Yellowstone are fairly sensitized, and with declining foods, they're moving out of the park and out of protection. And one of the reasons I'm adamantly against the delisting at this time is that I think we can expect a precipitous increase in the mortality. And the mortality currently is unhealthy enough, but I think when states get the management of the bears, it's quite clear they'll open a hunting season, and without enforcement of killing, I think we can expect vandal killing and illegal killing and just people that are afraid of bears and will claim defense of life and property when they shoot a bear, when the bear may have no ill intent in its mind. They just walk into an armed person. So the scenario of losing the protection of the Endangered Species Act, I think, at this time is unwarranted.
Thank you. Barrie, many people don't have a context within which to put the current Yellowstone grizzly bear population size, which is estimated somewhere around 700, 750 bears. And as a scientist, maybe you can talk about this and what it might mean to hunt bears or increase grizzly bear mortality and killing, as you were just discussing.
Yeah, that's a good point. We see in the press the federal managers crowing about how we've had such a comeback of the bears from the low of maybe 130 to 140 bears. You might counter-argue that to say what other direction could they go unless being extinguished. So even if we have 600 or 700 bears, I think you could make the argument, probably Lance Craighead would do better at this, but the question of genetic isolation is important. Bears are fairly adaptable, so, the evolution of them is a long-term prospect, but inbreeding can occur rather rapidly. And I think if we continue killing bears that tend to be, if you like, the innovators, the ones that do somewhat, if you like, exploratory things, whether it's with their own food base, the natural food base, or human food base, we'll be doing directional selecting. We'll be shooting and genetically changing the bears that are daytime bears and possibly turning them into nocturnal bears over a relatively short period of time. If they learn to avoid people because of mistreatment, if you like, of all kinds, any kind of negative interaction, we can expect that they'll become smaller and rarer. And this has happened in Europe over centuries. The European brown bears tend to be nocturnal. They're small, and they avoid people at all costs. Probably that's the only way they've lasted as long as they have. In the north of Spain, between Spain and France, and in Scandinavia, they're not quite. There are more of them there. But this is a realistic possibility, and would in the extreme case, drive bears to very low numbers, if not extinguish them. If people think this is some kind of academic pie in the sky, they can read Hank McCutcheon's work about the black bears that he studied in Rocky Mountain Park, and there were bears there that were shot outside of this small park, and they were not tolerated near people inside the park, and they had no garbage problem. These bears went into the high elevation areas and did exactly what I just said. They became small. They were cryptic or shy in all cases, and there were less than 100 of them left, mainly because they didn't reproduce very well. They had a very poor food base, and basically they were driven by their shy behavior, which put them in areas where there weren't people, but also put them in bad food base. So coming back to the Yellowstone ecosystem grizzly bears, we know that they've lost at least two of their major food sources and are dispersing. Now, the federal managers have taken the position it's because they're up to carrying capacity and there are high numbers of them, but the alternative, which I think is equally plausible scientifically, is that the food base has declined and they're spreading out and becoming less dense. They're obviously showing up down the Wind Rivers in Teton Park. We're seeing more and more grizzly bears, especially some that are readily seen from the side of the road. So all of those bears that go outside of Yellowstone Park and Teton Park will be exposed to killing, hunting, illegal poaching, all kinds of things like that. And considering, again, the biology there, they're wide-ranging, looking for food. They will no doubt be much more exposed than a population that stays within the park if they were feeding on white bark pine, for example, or larvae of moths or trout along the 52 streams that used to have Yellowstone cutthroat trout. So all of the concentrated food bases within the secure areas are depressed or gone. The trout are essentially gone for the bears, being replaced by lake trout. And so we have a situation where the behavior of the bears takes them outside the park. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm. One of the other issues that's come up, maybe you can talk about this a little more, is the genetic health of the population, being that Yellowstone's grizzly bears have been isolated for well over 100 years now. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service has proposed as part of its delisting plan to truck bears in from other ecosystems maybe every 10 years to deal with the genetic isolation. How would you deal with the issue, and do you think the isolation is a problem?
Well, I certainly think it's a potential problem. You have a population that's isolated, and it may be maintained by a relatively few number of females and males. So that's a recipe for genetic homogeneity. One of the better ways, of course, and I believe you've argued this as forcefully as anybody, is that we need connections between populations in other places. So I would like to see the capturing and collaring reduced or phased out and replace it with captured hair DNA studies, trail cameras, and direct observations of the bears. I think we could get adequate information about numbers and what the bears are doing out there with those techniques, and spend some of the effort to try and reconnect with other populations to the north and especially to the west. I think that kind of a connectivity is clearly more important than bringing bears in from other areas. The more we ship bears off to zoos and shoot certain kinds of bears, we're immediately restricting the genetic heterogeneity. Whatever variation is represented by those kinds of bears is being lost. And as I mentioned earlier, it's very easy to have directional selection and rapid evolution occurring. When you get a combination of behavioral change that's successful for the bear, but it may be a social trap for the bears may innovate some technique, but it could end up to their death, then that clearly restricts the genetic underpinnings, the predisposition of the genes to relate to certain kinds of behaviors. This is how evolution works. The bears innovate in some way, say it's a new way of catching food, and then those bears that have the genetic predisposition to do that kind of innovating increase in the population, and they outbreed the other animals that aren't as successful. I think we see this probably in Yosemite with bear problems. We get garbage feeding and backpack food feeding bears that are so successful they grow large. The males dominate the breeding, and the females pass these traits on, and they get what I call a behavioral epidemic. Basically, problem bears take over, and the non-problem bears get restricted and become a smaller part of the population. So basically, the park management and the bad behavior by people leaving their food unprotected creates essentially a new species of bear. Urbis garbensis, I guess. Ursus garbensis.
A population of raving adolescent behavior.
That's right. And it's successful in terms of the gene pool, but it ends up being catastrophic for the population. And I'm a little concerned that we don't spend enough time thinking about these mechanisms in the grizzly.
Well, one of the principles of wildlife management seems to be control and management of wildlife. It's not a neutral, observationally based field. It's often capturing, following, intrusively based practices, and yet...
Yeah, you're right. I taught in the wildlife department, and hands-on stuff always tends to be dominated by men. Some people think it's a substitute for hunting. You just get yourself a collaring license. But you're right. The range of kinds of science is pretty limited, and I think we've had 40 or 50 years of radio collaring, and I think it's time to do something else.
Well, maybe you mentioned Yellowstone Park's research on about people and their effects on bears, and I've been really interested in your work on human-bear interactions in Alaska and some of the takeaway lessons perhaps for places like Yellowstone and the Northern Rockies. Maybe you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, one of the contrasts that occurs to me and anybody that's been to Brooks River or McNeil Falls is that when bears are protected from hunting for long periods of time, and Brooks River is in the middle of a very large park, and they haven't been exposed to hunting or any kinds of shooting, legal or illegal, for decades, if not hundreds of years. And the result of this is that bears are basically tolerant of people, even when they haven't had much experience with them. And when they have had a lot of experience, they become extremely tolerant, which means they essentially ignore people. And many of the mountain bears are pretty much exactly the opposite, especially Yellowstone bears. And we need to understand why. Now, in the salmon stream situation like McNeil and Brooks River, you have a huge supply of food, so that there's tremendous pressure on the bears behaviorally to come to that food, and they have to put up with whatever they tend to dislike. If they really don't like people that much, they have to either overcome that or wait until night to come in, or we've dealt with bears after the camps have closed, and we stay there as researchers, and it's a bit of a dangerous time, because the bears that what I say don't like people are the ones that'll charge you on a Sunday morning when you're walking where you've walked all summer long, and every bear has just ignored you, and then this new bear starts bluff charging you because it doesn't like people. Well, there's the contrast. The bears in Yellowstone aren't the way they are totally because they're food stressed and they're competitive. There may be a certain amount of that. Bears don't like other bears near them when there's let's say a small berry bush or a carcass that only will feed one bear. But if you have a superabundance of salmon, then bears tend not to compete with each other. What they do is try to wolf down as much of the salmon as there are, and the Alaskan bears on salmon streams are good at that. I think it's made them a more tolerant bear, ready to accept people sooner. But if we increase the food supply for bears inside the park or secure areas, and until the bears get used to people, we should restrict the access of visitors in the park. We need to let the bears in the park get better access to higher quality food. And I've proposed in the past that the forests around the park ought to be closing roads, and in fact doing some planting of berry shrubs and this sort of thing that could concentrate bears away from areas that people had access to. I think it's pretty clear to me, and Dr. David Mattson has made the case that Yellowstone is really depauperate when it comes to berry shrubs. In North America, there's something like 130 species of shrubs that produce berries that bears would eat, and Yellowstone has very few of these, and I suspect that's due to the phase of the decades in which elk ate everything up to about 5 feet or 6 feet high. And so I don't think I'll ever convince Yellowstone to plant berry shrubs, but if bears got in high enough numbers, they might be moving seeds around, and we could see a change in habitat. Now, speaking of bear numbers, this brings me to another point, and that is that we shouldn't be satisfied with densities of bears such that they're just representative of bear species. They should be there in densities where their ecosystem function is at what it would have been, let's say, 500 years ago. In that way, you have the ecosystem function by the various animals, including the carnivores and omnivores, at a natural level, and that seems to be a more reasonable goal. I think Joel Berger has made this point, as have a couple of others, that wolves, grizzlies, any carnivore ought to be present in numbers where they perform the role in the ecosystem. And having worked in Katmai for so many years, I saw this in spades there with the bears transporting fish into the forest, which is being studied in many, many places. Bears, being large, can carry nutrients and seeds long distances. And the bears at Brooks River are really unique in that they spend about 4 months feeding on the same run of salmon at different stages in the run. So they are clearly there in high densities and having a natural and large, you might say, an optimum effect within the ecosystem. And this is another reason, of course, to maintain places like Yellowstone at as wild as we can, so that we still have the opportunity to understand some of these processes.
That's a good suggestion. Barry, you've been translating your science and other research of other scientists and applying it in a policy context and regarding management for many, many years around grizzly bears. But other scientists seem to be reluctant to speak out on controversial matters, particularly things like grizzly bear delisting. Why do you think that is, even if the science and some of the science is pretty straightforward?
I think there's a feeling, especially in American universities and Canadian ones, that your job is basically to bring the science forward and let others translate it into policy and management, and I like to think of it as values. But I have a problem with some of my colleagues who wear a number of hats, but they often won't take the conservation citizen's hat very often. I think they feel like you're either a popularizer or it will reduce the if you like, the purity of your research. Again, the term purity makes me laugh because scientists aren't, there's no such thing as being a totally objective person. We all have our values, if only our value to do research. But I'm not a sociologist. I can't explain why my colleagues in universities don't do this, but it's certainly a problem. I think a lot of them know what should be done, and I'm, of course, retired from the university and feel like I can bring my science to bear on policy issues, and I don't mind making suggestions for changes in policy if you have the experience and broad knowledge of bears like I have had the opportunity to gain. I think it's immoral to sit on your hands and watch a bad situation get worse. If they did, you're quite familiar with this with your colleagues, but if we had more scientists looking at the data that the government has collected at the taxpayers' expense, I think we would have good debates about the interpretation of the data. Unfortunately, now it's closed shop. They have the data. They draw the conclusions, and they make the implications for management all in a totally political atmosphere. And I think this is very unhealthy. We just exchanged prime ministers. The last one had a problem with any kind of science and was closing laboratories and libraries about as fast as he could. And that's a move that goes against democracy. I think you have the more transparent the information that's collected in science. If we claim to do science-based management, then we have to look at the science.
So, Barrie, one of the concerns that you hear from people just in the public about grizzly bears is fear. Fear about bear attacks, and certainly you've had your own personal experience with that. How concerned do you think people should be about bear attacks, and what can they do to minimize that risk?
Well, the obvious thing is to learn a little more about them and get some exposure. I think if you spent some time in Yellowstone, even if it's the side of the road, you would realize that there are lots and lots of instances where you can come in contact with them. I've done that myself, even in backcountry. But I think going in parties of 3 or 4 is always a good idea. We have bear spray now, which changes the equation quite a bit. It, in fact, changes the behavior of the person carrying it. If you feel like you're armed, you're much more likely to stand and face a bear that's trying to bluff you off a trail and gives you time to back off carefully. I think our friend and colleague Doug Peacock has explained this quite well in his book. But I think going out with nature guides and this sort of thing probably helps people decrease their fear level or anxiety. Most fear and anxiety comes from an ignorance of what to do, and a few bromides don't help. You can't tell someone how to be a good sea captain in a half-hour lecture. You have to build up experience over time. But I think that the fear of bears is much overdone. It is wilderness country, and you have to accept the risks, but it shouldn't stop you from going out for an afternoon walk in a meadow. I wouldn't like to see 20,000 people go into the backcountry in a hurry because we've all lost our anxieties about bears. I think a certain amount of the country should be left to the bears by themselves.
So, Barrie, how optimistic are you that Yellowstone grizzly bears can finally be recovered?
Well, I'm optimistic that they can be recovered because we do see some management policy changes, like tolerating bears at the sides of the road, the habituation idea that I think Carrie Gunther, the bear biologist, has promoted quite successfully, and I think convinced managers and superintendents. But if we go in the direction of delisting, I'm not at all optimistic because I think the bears will spread out, and they're wide-ranging enough that a large proportion of them will be exposed to killing on the outside. I'll never forget a lesson I listened to from Al Lovis in Alaska when he was the regional chief scientist for the Alaska region. And he told me that every wolf pack in Denali Park was exposed to trapping at the periphery. They were no more managing a protected population of wolves than I'm the king of Siam. You know, we have these ideas that the grizzlies are protected in Yellowstone, but they are not protected if they're captured continuously and they're going outside and being killed legally or illegally outside the park. So I think we need protected zones, a big boundary around park, and even beyond where they're currently seen, that the bears maintain their protected status. I think opening a hunting season is absolutely the wrong direction. I don't think grizzly bears are a huntable species. They're hunted as though they're vermin, and I think it's a question of values, that we value grizzlies too much to treat them as just another huntable population. I think we should have species that are never hunted, doesn't matter what the numbers are, and you might pick some kinds of swans or something like that are protected just because they're beautiful birds, and I think we could do the same for grizzly bears.
You have been listening to Louisa Wilcox with Grizzly Times, speaking today with Dr. Barrie Gilbert, animal behaviorist and grizzly bear expert. Thank you, Barrie.